So I spent many months doing this when a friend told me that actually that's how they had translated the King James version of the Bible. This was a great surprise to me because I thought I'd come up with a new method, starting with the words, and by translating, first transliterating the Mujem al-Mufaris, which lists all the nouns and verbs and particles, some particles, that appear in the Quran, and then translating from that, and then creating a database. So I thought that this was a new method, and I wasn't even sure it was going to work when I first embarked upon this. But I was quite happy to hear that someone else had done this, even though it had been in the 17th century, and we're now in the 21st century, and this is the first time anyone has applied this method to the translation of the Holy Quran. So anyway, I had spent many years studying classical Arabic grammar at Tehran University in the PhD program, and also with a private tutor. And since the Macintosh, when I began, and I love my Mac, the Mac had no Arabic software program, so I had to transliterate the basically 90,000 words that appear in the Quran. The method that I used that they had also used in translating the King James Version of the Bible is called formal equivalence, and it is an interpretation, translation that allows for no interpretation. It is a strict translation of the Quran, and if by any chance I had to add a word that is not in the Arabic text, I put it in italics so that the reader would know that this word will not be in the Arabic text. So for me, an interpretation is like a woman who has to pray behind a wall in a mosque. You never know who the imam is. You're not sure what his beliefs are. You're not sure how he treats his wife and how he treats his children. You know nothing about him, and you can't even see him because you're behind a wall. This, to me, was how an interpretation would be, and I felt that we need at least one translation of the Quran that is as close as possible to the original without interpretation. The second thing is that I believe that the Quran is universal, that the Blessed Prophet did not bring a new religion, but he came to confirm the religions of the past. Therefore, the messages of the previous prophets are as important as the message of our prophet. And it's important for what the Quran means to me today, not what is its history, but that's important, and there are translations and commentaries that a person can find to look those up and to study them. That's another method. But there also needs to be a method where the Quran speaks to us, each one individually today, that it becomes our sacred text and that I learn to identify with it so that it becomes part of my life. And the only way that I can do that is that if I understand the meanings of what the Quran has to say. If the Quran is eternal, then what does it say to me today? That's what I needed to know. And I needed to have the reader know who might not know the Arabic. I also felt, looking at the previous translations of the Quran, that all of them used exclusive language. That is, if you are a Muslim, you can understand what the language of the Quran is saying in many cases. But if you're not Muslim, or if you're a new Muslim, then it does not include you. It is exclusive. So I tried very hard to translate an inclusive type of Quran translation. So the Quran says very clearly, speak to people in their own language. Therefore, it has to speak to the English-speaking person in English without Arabic words that have to be learned before you can understand what the meaning of the Quran is. The Blessed Prophet was a mercy for all of humanity. That means that the Quran is inclusive, and it is universal, and it is for everyone. Now, examples of how inclusive language would be, for instance, in regard to the word kufr or kafir. Normally, this is translated as disbeliever or infidel, but the same exact word also means to be ungrateful. Ungrateful is an inclusive term. It includes everyone. All of us, every human being in the world, can at some time feel that they have not been grateful to God for their blessings, that they have been ungrateful. Therefore, instead of labeling people, you invite people in. And also, for instance, I use God instead of Allah because we're speaking English. And while many Muslims feel that Allah cannot be translated and that they somehow imply that Muslims have a monopoly on the Arabic word of God or Allah, they forget that the Arabic-speaking Christians and the Arabic-speaking Jews also use the word Allah, and that the Old Testament and the New Testament, when they're translated into Arabic, they use the word Allah. Therefore, it is not a word that is exclusive to Muslims. It is the name of God, and in order not to create disharmony, but in order to bring people in, you have to speak to them in their own language. Many times I've spoken at mosques and churches and other places, and the first question that comes up is that, well, I don't understand your religion. You have a different God than I have. And I said, how is that? And, well, you call your God Allah, and I call him God. So I'm trying to explain that it's the same word, that one is an Arabic word for the same concept in the English language. Therefore, it's better to use God in English when we're speaking and we want to be inclusive and we want to speak about the universality of the Quran. Then people relate to the concept of God using the word God rather than the concept of using the word Allah. Another problem is that because people feel that the King James Version of the Bible is outdated in the sense that it uses thou and thee, that it's better in the Quran translation to use you. Now, the problem with you is that, first of all, the Arabic language has a declension for the second person singular, thee or thou. And when people in the Persian-speaking world or Urdu-speaking world or Turkish-speaking world speak to God and pray to God, they always use the second person singular. They don't use the plural. You is plural. So if we translate God as, and if we're speaking to God as you, then we're making God plural. We're creating more gods than there are. And this is the only sin that is not forgiven in the Quran. Therefore, it's important that we keep the concept of thou and thy and thine in the translation. But what I did in the English-only translation was I put you in bold for the reader, so the reader would know that the original of that was the second person singular, thou. And this then at least keeps the concept alive, and we're not speaking at that point to God as plural. So I created, as I said, this database so that it's also easy to translate the Quran into other languages, and as it was the case with the King James Version of the Bible. That was a translation that lasted for 300 years because of the consistency in translation. Now, the Quran means recitation, where the reciter takes a breath or pauses determines the meaning. So I have indicated these also in the translation at the end of the line by a certain sign, which I describe in the preface, so that somebody knows if they're listening to the Arabic and they hear the reciter take a breath, they know why they are taking a breath there. And very often they have to pause because it changes the meaning if they continue the reading.